This is some wrong stuff over here. This is like, careful, fam. This is like history. Like, I don't understand. And I think American people are so disconnected from it. Princess Diana had a big thing about mines and cluster bombs, fam. She was so against it because it doesn't go after soldiers. It doesn't hurt anybody. And I can't understand the explanation for this, fam. Do you want to say anything before I dive into the article? Yeah. But wow, holy shit.
Yeah. So obviously Biden, I think I was one of the first people to say this because we were covering this and it looked like he was going to do it. And so by all accounts, I knew he was going to do it. And then he did it. He announced that they were going to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. If you go back a few months ago when Jen Psaki was the spokeswoman for the Biden administration, she considered cluster bombs a war crime. And they were saying that Russia was using them. And so they said that it constitutes a war crime. Well, that all apparently didn't happen because Joe Biden decided to support Ukraine by sending these cluster bombs. And I have a video that explains exactly why cluster bombs are a problem. And they're basically one bomb that has little bombs in it, or what you would call bomblets, and they break up into tiny pieces. And they stay there years and years and years after they have blown up. And some of the countries that have experienced these cluster bombs are Cambodia, Vietnam, the Southeast Asian countries that dealt with U.S. intervention. And so Brian was on there earlier. I don't think I put that video on there. And Brian, obviously, and Vanessa were on the show on Friday, which everybody really liked that. That was a really good show. We discussed pretty much everything. And we did mention the cluster bombs, but he talked about the fact that this is definitely a big thing when it comes to these countries in Southeast Asia that are still feeling the side effects and the consequences of these cluster bombs. So this is why there's a treaty between these countries that have gone after the United States. They're NATO allies. Germany, England, and others have said, you shouldn't be doing this. So when NATO says you're doing really bad, if NATO is telling the United States that they shouldn't be doing this, how awful and psychopathic do you have to be? I mean, this is just, if NATO is the voice of reason, please tell me how awful do you have to be, right? So why don't you go ahead and get into the article and then we'll get into the rest of it. But there is absolutely no excuse to supporting Joe Biden in this. And of course, the same day that Joe Biden decided to send these cluster bombs, AOC decided to endorse them. And so did Bernie Sanders. And we're going to talk about that. But go ahead, fam.
Sorry about that, fam. Is this the video on RT, the one from RT that explains what's going on with the bombs?
Yeah, but if you want to talk about your article first, we can do that.
You know, let's go right into the video, because if it has a visual, okay, and we can talk about the bomblets. I mean, that word alone, bomblets. And, you know, I reached out to Scott Ritter to see if I can get him on the show. He was busy for today. I want somebody to come on that's going to really explain what these things have done before. Like I said, Princess Diana, and you were talking about Southeast Asia, you know, she led a whole charge against this to get rid of mines, to get rid of cluster bombs, because who they affect when they're left behind. It is a shame. Let's take a look and see what RT has to say about this.
Amid the apparent lack of any significant progress in the counteroffensive, Washington this week decided to equip Kiev cluster bombs, a big story you'll have seen. Now, a Pentagon official is of the view, we heard from him saying that essentially casualties caused by the munitions are ultimately of secondary importance to stopping a Russian victory.
I'm as concerned about the humanitarian circumstance as anybody. But the worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win the war. And so it's important that they don't.
The Biden administration's decision to supply Kiev's regime with cluster munitions is yet another blatant manifestation of the aggressive anti-Russian policy of the United States, which aims to prolong the conflict in Ukraine as long as possible and wage war until the last Ukrainian. By supplying cluster munitions, Washington will in fact be an accomplice in mining the territory and will fully share the responsibility for the deaths caused by the explosions, including those of Russian and Ukrainian children. The transfer of cluster munitions is a gesture of desperation and evidence of powerlessness in the face of the failure of Ukraine's touted counteroffensive.
And something significant surrounding all this, Washington's move provoked a rare split among allies in the normally united stance to the conflict. The Spanish defense minister expressed reservations, along with the German foreign minister and the British prime minister, who we'll hear from in a second. All three countries are signatories to the cluster munition treaty that bans their use.
Spain, based on the firm commitment it has with Ukraine, also has a firm commitment that certain weapons and bombs cannot be delivered under any circumstances. No to cluster bombs, and yes to the legitimate defense of Ukraine, which we understand should not be carried out with cluster bombs.
I have followed the media reports. For us, as a state party, the Oslo Agreement on the Convention on Cluster Munition applies.
The UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use.
Well, just to give some background here, hundreds of smaller bomblets from an inner canister. The small bombs are then dispersed over a large attack area. They have a comparatively high so-called flood rate that results in greater numbers of casualties, even years after they've been launched. Former senior security policy analyst in the office of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Michael Maloof, says the countries opposed to Washington's decision, well, they should stand fast, but isn't convinced they will.
I think that it's remarkable that the NATO countries, who some 2/3 of the NATO countries actually are signatories to that convention to prevent cluster bombs. And it's incredible that they'll still go along with the United States in allowing that to happen. They've got to stand firm now and make a stand. They haven't done that up until now, and I think that they're going to have to. And I'm hoping that this could be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, in which they say, okay, that's enough, and that they're going to resist this. As long as they follow the United States in this, look where the United States has taken them to date. And it's nothing more than an escalation of this conflict. So let's see if they stand up now to the United States and resist this decision. They can turn it around. They can say to the put pressure on the United States that they're not going to do it. But they're weak. All these countries are weak. Unless they start showing these countries have got to say enough. And mean it, and do something about it, and make presentations to the White House to say that this is unacceptable.
Right. So you can see why these cluster bombs are a problem. And I mean, you have England, Spain, and Germany all saying no. We said no to these things. I mean, I don't know what that tells you, fam, but it tells you where the United States has lost their mind in terms of the consequences. And by the way, they say they care about Ukrainians. This is literally going to blow up Ukrainians, especially children, kind of like the pedal mines that Eva Bartlett has been covering in Donbass. These things can explode way after the fact. And they have been found to maim so many people. So it's going to maim a lot of people. It's going to create people who lose limbs, who lose their lives because of this. And what exactly does this do for Ukraine in the conflict as a whole? It absolutely does nothing, because it's not going to change anything whatsoever.
So there is and it's kind of interesting. There is a article out, and Rishi, we were just talking about, the Brits. Rishi's even saying that, we shouldn't use these things. But
the UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production.
That's the one we just saw.
Munitions and discourages their use. We will continue to do our part to support Ukraine against Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion. We've done that by providing heavy battle tanks and most recently long-range weapons, you know, and hopefully all countries can continue to support Ukraine. Russia's act of barbarism is causing untold suffering to millions of people. It's right that we collectively stand up to it, and I'll be heading off to the NATO summit next week in Vilnius, where we will be discussing exactly this with our allies, how we can strengthen our support for Ukraine.
The thing that just drives me crazy, it's just no matter what, it's kind of like, yeah, it's bad, but we're going to do it anyways. And I hope these other countries can still participate. Fam, from what you've been hearing, your talk around anywhere in your neck of the woods, is there some type of legitimate excuse for saying, okay, these are going to be essential for Ukraine to win the war because, or help them win the war, or help them with their advance because it does X, Y, and Z. And there is this talk that Russia's been using cluster bombs the whole time. I haven't heard about that until, of course, right now when Biden wants to send the cluster bombs. But do you see any legitimacy in what they're saying whatsoever about how it could help them win the war, or we're doing it because they're doing it?
No, it's not going to help them win the war at all, because Ukraine has been losing thousands of men. They've been losing, their counteroffensive massively failed. And pretty much everybody, including the military in the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, are saying that they are not where they would like to be. So these cluster bombs are only made to pretty much maim and destroy people. They're literally a target for civilians. They're not even a military type of ammunition. That's why they're banned. So it's just, you're not really going after the military by using these cluster bombs. You're going after civilians, and that includes your own civilians. Yeah. Because if you're talking about a conflict zone, you're going to have Ukrainians there as well. And again, this is a point where you're going to have people who have nothing to do with anything step on one of these years later and be blown off because of it. That's the whole point, is these things last, people are still dealing with it decades and decades after the wars and of U.S. interference in countries like Laos and Vietnam and Cambodia. So they know for a fact that this is a thing. This is why they've been speaking out against it. And they have said this is absolutely unacceptable. And you know, and even NATO, who have zero issue being terrorists as an organization, and have zero issue talking about, you know, Russia's unjustified illegal war against Ukrainians and blah, 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 and have zero issue supporting Nazis in Ukraine, have an issue with these cluster bombs. So there is no excuse, honestly, to be using them. And it just seems to me that this is more of a move to sort of puff your chest rather than anything else. And the fact that Joe Biden is supporting this, and he's being supported by all these quote unquote progressives, literally in spite of this, really just goes to show you how far they're willing to go to create this narrative.
Yeah, it almost seems like it's a F around and find out. Like, you want to resist us, at the end, we'll get as dirty as we can. We're going to send cluster bombs at the end. You shouldn't have opposed us in the first place, because nothing's off the table for us. We've danced and kind of talked about nuclear weapons. I mean, this just shows you how far the military-industrial complex is out of control, completely out of control. And we're going to talk about some more stuff today. Very interesting stuff, fam. I found out over the weekend. I didn't even know what was going on in April, where Lavrov was meeting with Biden's and Blinken's bosses. We'll talk about that later. But I do have a video right here from Nico kind of chiming in from Ro Khanna, fam. Your favorite progressive, the head of the squad, supposedly that he was going to be the one they were going to troll out there and run him out for president. We got a quick minute, 27 seconds from Nico over at Hotspot. Take a listen, guys. Ro Khanna throwing his 2 cents into the cluster bomb argument.
After the U.S. basically begged Ukraine to commit war crimes, after they sent them a bunch of cluster bombs, Ro Khanna decided to chime in and say, it's really our fault because we don't get to send them enough conventional artillery. Therefore, we have to send them artillery that will no doubt lead to thousands of civilian casualties. Maybe Roll is right, everybody. Maybe we just haven't sent Ukraine enough weapons, and we're being too hard on Rokana making that claim. Like, they basically are fighting with sticks and stones, hoping that they can break a couple of bones. Like, there is no research that I have found that shows that we are sending an adequate amount of weapons to Ukraine. Oh, that was just a super long list of conventional weapons that we've already sent to Ukraine. In fact, the longest list out of all the countries who have sent weapons to Ukraine already, in case you missed the sarcasm. But he didn't stop there. He somehow used this tweet as an opportunity to fearmonger about China having too much access to too much steel, which in truth is the fault of the US, but that's neither here nor there. When you couple Rose tweets with Lindsey Graham's recent tweet about working with Democrats and Republicans to grant admission to Ukraine to join NATO, it makes you think there's a bipartisan effort to start World War III, bro.
Fam, they're always going to find a way, whether it be on the left or the right, fam. It doesn't make a difference. They're always going to bring it back to you-know-who.
China.
Always. Always. No matter what, they're going to bring it back to China. Really quickly, just so we have it, fam, I'm just going to really blitz through this really quick because it's the article. You know we love our boy Dave DeCamp over there at antiwar.com. Biden defends decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. Last year, the White House said the use of cluster munitions was a potential war crime, except for when we do it, fam. President Biden on Friday said, and I'm riding with Biden, defended his decision to arm Ukraine with cluster bombs, which are banned by over 100 nations because of their exceptionally harmful, because they are exceptionally harmful to citizens. The Pentagon announced Friday that the U.S. was sending cluster munitions to Ukraine as part of an $800 million weapons package. How many of these 800 million, billions, whatever packages we have? Kiev will receive dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, DPI, CMs, small bomblets, when they're getting all cute calling them bomblets, packaged into 155 millimeter artillery shells designed to spread munitions. On February 28th, 2022, the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and this is what you mentioned, fam, who now has her own TV show on MSNBC once a week on Saturdays, if you haven't seen it, or it might be on Sundays, told reporters that Russia's use of cluster munitions in Ukraine would potentially be a war crime. But now the Biden administration has changed its tune on the widely banned munitions. Speaking to CNN's Fareed Zakaria on Friday, President Biden said he needed to send cluster bombs because Ukraine and the U.S. are running out of ammunition. Oh, Jesus Christ. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of the ammunition, and we're low on it, he said. And so what I finally did is I took recommendations of the Defense Department to not permanently, but to allow for the transition period while we get more 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians. While Biden frames the provision of the cluster bombs as temporary, Colin Kahl, Undersecretary of the Defense for Policy, said the U.S. will arm Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of munitions. Cluster bombs are especially hazardous to civilians because many of the bomblets don't explode on impact, meaning people would find them years later. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. dropped millions of cluster bomblets on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and each country is still dealing with them to this day. Kahl insisted that the cluster munitions the U.S. will send to the Ukraine were tested and will have a dud rate, listen to this, fam, I love this part, of 2.35%. But the New York Times reported that the rate will be closer to 14% due to the factors on the battlefield not taken into account during the Pentagon test. The Times report said each 155 millimeter artillery shell will be packed with 72 bomblets, a dud rate of 14%. Each shell will leave behind about 10 unexploded bombs, a major hazard for civilians if they are not cleaned up. Kahl said the U.S. has received assurances that Ukraine's won't cluster munitions in civilian-populated urban environments. That's going to be kind of interesting since they've only been firing in, civilian environments. But cluster munitions are incredibly hazardous to people living in rural areas, as they are often found by farmers or children playing in forests. Ukraine has a history of using cluster bombs against civilian populated areas. In 2014, Human Rights Watch reported that the Kiev government was using cluster munitions in populated areas of Donetsk city. Ukraine has also used cluster bombs in populated areas during the current conflict with Russia. A day before the Pentagon announced it was arming Ukraine with cluster bombs, HRW issued a report, this is Human Rights Watch, that said the Ukrainian forces killed at least 8 civilians with cluster bombs in the eastern city of Izium in 2022. Human Rights Watch said Russian forces have also killed many civilians with cluster bombs, and the Biden administration officials have defended their decisions by pointing to the Russians' use of controversial munitions. The U.S., Russia, and Ukraine are not signatories to the treaty that bans the munitions known as the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Fam, I know you are, but what am I? They're using them, so we're using them. That's the excuse they're going to use. I don't know. Final thoughts on this. This is kind of messed up. I don't even know what to say anymore. It's so messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware of Russia using them, but I will say that the thing that disturbed me the most was what's his name, Colin Kahl's statement that it's more important to stop a Russian victory than to save civilians, and he flat out said that, and that is extremely disturbing. Because if you're talking about Ukrainians and saving them, this is going to do the opposite. So, and I don't think they care, because as we found out, the foreign mercenaries are the ones that are being sent to fight the strong positions and strongholds of the Russian military, and they don't really care about saving them. They're not really sending the Ukrainians there. So there's this perspective that, you know, this war is just using these people as cannon fodder. And so they don't really care that they are going to lose people, because again, the whole point is to the last Ukrainian, right? So, yeah. And on this section, too, I wanted to address the AOC, support of Joe Biden. She backed Biden for re-election, and she did this on the day, of course, where these, cluster, munitions were approved. And this is the person who a few years ago ran as a progressive to, you know, knock down the establishment, to challenge the status quo. She was supposed to be somebody that was going to follow in the footsteps of Bernie Sanders. And it turns out she's more of a warmonger than Bernie Sanders himself, who has also endorsed Joe Biden, in spite of the fact that there are other candidates, one of them being Cornel West, who was a part of his campaign. In spite of the fact there are candidates that are speaking against nuclear war, he has decided to endorse Joe Biden, the guy who pretty much he fought with for decades on the floor of Congress. So it is really strange to see, but not surprising that AOC has turned out to be worse. And she's basically Nancy Pelosi Jr. at this point, supporting the same policies. And, you know, the Democrats are going to rave about how happy they are that their party is so united, but their party is so united in war. The party is so united that it makes the Republicans look less war hungry in many ways, at least when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. So she is backing Joe Biden, and she went on none other than Pod Save America, the most liberal podcast you can go on, and said she was going to support Biden. And she said this, she said, I believe, given that field, that yes, she's going to support him. And she said, I think he's done quite well, given the limitations that we have. I do think there are ebbs and flows, as there are in any presidency. So I mean, this is what we're used to with the Democrats, right? A lot of what is it? Word salad. Have you seen Kamala Harris's latest comments? I mean, she says a whole lot of nothing, right? And this is what AOC has turned into, and none of her little sycophants can make any excuses now. How can you excuse this? She has the opportunity to endorse other people or not endorse anybody at all. And she's choosing to endorse Joe Biden at a time when he's pushing for more war with Russia, for more weapons for Ukraine. There is absolutely no excuse at this point, and the only reason I'm mentioning it is because we're talking about these cluster bombs. So, I mean, this is, you know, this is a whole part of this thing. And there's a video where you can see and really get nauseous watching her, how she pretty much is, her transformation is complete. Or maybe this is who she always was, which is where I'm leaning as well.
While you mentioned AOC, I also want to mention this too as well. In New York, she was questioned the other day, and watch the handlers, how they try to protect her. She was asked the other day, in, you know, New York, you had all these people during the mandates that lost their job, close to 50,000, you know, workers that lost their job. And ever since they dropped the mandates, a lot of these workers been looking to go back to work to get their jobs back, but they still haven't been able to do it. Well, you know, let's hear what AOC has to say about them with her word salad about should those people who were mandated, my body, my choice, remember that? They were mandated. Now the mandates have been dropped. They still haven't been able to return to work. Let's listen.
Yeah, local reporter. You just heard me just one question.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good to see you.
Good to see you. How's it going?
So I want to ask you this question because you're such a strong supporter of labor rights, civil rights, bodily autonomy. All of these issues come together with the issue of New Yorkers who lost their jobs during the pandemic due to mandates.
Due to the mandates.
And there's still a lot of those people who have not been reinstated, who want to be reinstated. What is your position on that? Would you support reinstating those New York City workers and state workers who lost employment under the mandates and want to go back to work?
Yeah, well, you know, I believe the mayor had lifted many of those mandates towards the end of some of these shutdowns. But I think a lot of it, frankly, depends on the environment. In healthcare environments that are very sensitive, educational environments, I think these are things that need to kind of be looked at, and they tend to have different healthcare requirements per sector.
So those workers,
that was one question, my dear. I'm so sorry.
Not reinstated.
I'm so sorry. That was the one.
And
I think
this
it depends on the
sanitation workers.
I'm so sorry.
City workers.
We did the one. I'm so sorry.
I think it depends on the sector that first. Thank you.
Sanitation workers. Yes. No.
Sorry.
So, fam, who is she working for? Like, not even New Yorkers. She can really just, you know. Not even for New Yorkers, workers that she can stand up and go, hey, man, there were sanitation workers who didn't want to get the jab. They're still not out, been able to come back to work. We've ended the mandates. Let them go back to work. You're talking about, fam, in these positions in New York, you know, and I was just in New York, and I have a lot of family members who are in the unions and do construction workers. This is their livelihood. They've been doing it for so long. People in the medical field, nurses for doing it for so long, just looking to go back to work would get their job because they were unjustly told they had to take a medical procedure that they didn't want to take. And she's still kind of like, I don't know about if you heard that there, fam, but it seemed like she was kind of manufacturing consent for the mandates of sorts. Oh, it was just
of course she was.
Conditions and fam. And,
would you expect anything different from her? I mean, this is who she is. And who is she working for? She's definitely not working for the people of New York. She's definitely has handlers, and she's definitely working for the establishment. It's been very clear for a long time. So, it was brave of this person to ask her that question, good of this person to ask her that question, but she wasn't going to answer any different. That's who she is. And she was always supportive of not just the lockdowns, but the mandates themselves, and supportive of dividing people based on their vaccination status. And her whole contingent of her little supporters were also the same. These like vaccine fascists that wanted to look at people differently because they decided not to get a vaccine that we have now found out had a lot of issues. And so there's a lot that in spite of the fact that the CDC said they were safe and effective, there's a lot to look at. There's a lot of things that we talked about a long time ago, from the beginning of this whole thing in 2020, before it was safe to talk about, before all of this stuff. And now we've come full circle where, when you interviewed Cornel West, even he admitted he stopped getting the vaccine.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
So clearly, if somebody who believes in it suddenly said, okay, no more. And I have friends who are nurses themselves who refuse to take any more. These, I mean, this in the United States, this is a reality. This is not made up. And so that sentiment has shifted, and she's really dumb because people think New York could never go red. I disagree. I think New York could definitely go red. But obviously you'd have to have a fair election system. I think there are a lot more people who are not happy with people like AOC, I think, than they want you to think. And if you go throughout the United States, you will find that out very quickly. So, that's something. I'm glad you brought that up because this just really showcases her 100%. And we haven't done a show like this where we show a lot of clips about AOC because my mind has been on foreign policy, and even talking about this is sort of like weird to me now. But I think it does signify how the United States is literally in free fall right now. Your progressives are war criminals, are more warmongers than the Republicans. Everything is upside down. You don't have a fair election system. You can't rely on these people. So all you have to do really is continue to expose, but also look at it from a different perspective here. Because when it comes to foreign policy, this is where the progressives never cared. But this is why you need to care about foreign policy, because then you end up with somebody like this, like AOC.
I got to say this much is that, I was on Due Dissidence about a week and a half ago, fam, and I went on there to talk a little bit about what the whole pandemic was about. In Due Dissidence, they're at an area, they're lefties, and they're starting to look down that rabbit hole and start to kind of go down in a little bit. I talked about the real Anthony Fauci, the book, not so much because I'm trying to, talk about RFK, but 80% of that book, since people like me and you followed it in real time, understood what was going on when that book came out. There were certain things that, he might have tied together as far as his position, RFK, when it comes to going after three-letter agencies. But from us following this thing the whole time, to come full circle, they still have a lot of things in play, implemented in place behind the scenes as far as what they can do, their power, the way the government has gained more power, more spying power. They're looking for more reasons to give mandates now. They're talking about the WHO. They're still going through with the whole treaty. There's, people like Peter Hotez going to different countries talking about a global vaccine program. So there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes that, we've kind of drifted away from. Like you said, it feels a little funny talking about it. I haven't even talked that much about it. But before I went on Due Dissidence, I went back and looked at some of our videos. And holy shit, fam, we were, as leftists, we were probably out in front better than anybody. I think Kim Iverson was the only one who was kind of out there with us in some of the work we did. But now a lot of this information we know it to be true. The data is there. We have to start kind of circling the wagons and looking about it again. From what I witnessed in that whole 4th of July event, the medical freedom movement is kind of sticking their heads out. It's not just the Children's Health Defense. There's all these other groups, ex-nurses, ex-medical workers that are like, okay, they got through this again. They're trying to slime away without any recourse, without any punishment. And even furthermore, they're trying to make sure that the infrastructure is in place when it comes to track and trace using this pandemic, if not the next pandemic they're talking about. So it's something we're going to have to revisit a little bit, fam, as it comes around, because I think you're going to have more people talking about it. And you're going to hear more people repeating that same thing, safe and effective. It seemed to me that AOC was okay, despite any information whatsoever coming out, that she's okay that mandates were there and people lost their jobs. Because she's going to say it was about public health as she gets more pushed.
Of course, that's the excuse.
Say that. Yeah. I have your favorite, Jen Psaki. Fam, don't tell me you don't miss. Tell me you don't miss Psaki.
She could have come up with a better name than Inside. Who wants to be inside with Jen Psaki? Jesus. All right, we can play the video.
I'm just gonna play.
She made it too easy. She made it too easy.
Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has made her mark in Washington since being sworn into office in January of 2019. At that time, she was both the youngest woman and the youngest Latina to ever serve in Congress. In her years on the Hill, she's become a progressive voice people look to for guidance and reaction when things unfold, both in the Capitol and across the country. I got to chat with her recently about how she's made accountability a key part of her mission as an elected official. Here's a part of that conversation. So you're in the minority in Congress for the first time since you were elected. It seems like you're kind of having fun being a bit of an agitator. Are you enjoying that role?
I think holding those in power accountable is a fundamental part of...
Sorry, fam, really quick. Could I say something about that one sentence there? Ah! So,
I was just going to say, she took it out straight of the progressive phrase book there. Let's hold them account. I don't even like hearing that anymore. I don't, you said it the other day. No, you said it. We got to hold people account. I don't even like hearing it anymore. I think it's a bunch of bullshit. You're not holding anybody. How are you holding them accountable by doing exactly what they want you to do? And she's like, you know, you're this and that. No, she's not. She's literally done everything that they've wanted her to do at pretty much every turn. So it's laughable to see this. And look at how she's interviewing her. This is not an interview where you're being critical of somebody in a position of power. And of course it wouldn't be, because Jen Psaki herself is somebody that was hired by the State Department to do PR. And here she is on her own show on MSNBC doing PR. And she's not even really good either. Okay. And number one. And number two, she's having this girl time with AOC without asking her any hard questions, just literally fawning over how great she is and how she's Latina and the youngest woman and the first Latina. It's just literally the recipe of what they do and how they target these progressive groups. And they're just complete and total idiots now for following any of this. I mean, she's having a love fest with Jen Psaki. What more do you need to know? That she's literally not working for you.
Remember Ryan? I can't remember Ryan's last name, but the Democrat when he would always talk about this guy is the first, Muslim to hold this position. He's the second gay man to ever. They love throwing out those little accolades out there as if they mean something. He's the youngest woman of all time, the first Afro-Latino, whatever. All that shit, it doesn't make a difference anymore. Even I don't pay attention to it. I'm like, what are your politics? What are you going to do? And they constantly shield themselves from any tough media. You saw that one lady getting the one question, and it was like, how did they ask? Oh, that's your one question. Yeah, idiot, but she didn't even answer the question yet. I can't push her to answer the question. Maybe because and blah, blah, blah. Let's listen to the rest of this. Look at the hand movements one more time. We got to hear her say, I love holding power accountable one last time.
Sure. Are you enjoying that role?
I think holding those in power accountable is a fundamental part of our role. And it's a part of a role that I draw on from my history in advocacy and organizing and activism, but it's also one where we can propose solutions while we're also holding people accountable for the decisions that they're making. And so, yeah, I think it's been an important role for us to play.
So you're also a pretty politically astute observer. There is a presidential race that's happening right now. Donald Trump, people think, some say, is the easiest person for Joe Biden to run against. What do you think about that?
Well,
the easiest potential Republican nominee, I should say.
I think there's something to be said about that. The dynamics of these races change from day to day. I think that Governor DeSantis has made some very large critical errors. And I think he's weaker than...
What are his biggest errors, do you think, as you've watched?
Well, you can't out-Trump Trump, right? And that's what he's really been trying to do. His attacks on teachers, on schools, on LGBT Americans, I think go way too far in the state of Florida. And I think that they are a profound political miscalculation and an overcompensation. He may be trying
Can we stop it? This is almost done. Okay, so first of all, the only thing she got right is that DeSantis is going further to the right than Trump, but she mentions the LGBTQ stuff, but she doesn't mention is foreign policy and how DeSantis makes Trump look like a waffle compared to his neocon interventionist foreign policies that he would have all over the world, especially with China and Latin America. But she doesn't mention that because she's going to support very similar policies like that anyway. So she can't mention that, but she'll mention the LGBT and all the other stuff because she knows who she's talking to. That's the only valid point she made, that DeSantis is probably a candidate that Joe Biden could more easily be. I think Donald Trump is definitely going to be harder for Joe Biden. But other than that, if she says, I holding people accountable one more time, like, how many times
that's
does she have to say it?
That's part of their literature. Remember when she was attacked about like the whole Palestinian thing in the Iron Dome, and then what did she do? She just pivoted to like, well, listen, I hear you, and if we're going to talk about it, then we need to be about it. Lady, we just said that you voted for the Iron Dome, and we're talking about you. And yeah, I agree. We need to be about it. And then just, you know what I'm saying? She does that shit when it came to the what was it? The whole thing with the COVID when it came to the housing. Remember, like they didn't fucking figure out how to complete this, just a moratorium. And they're out there. Yeah, we're doing it. You know what I'm saying? That's it. They do exactly what Donald Trump does. Just brag about anything good. Just make yourselves look good. Just get people into the tribal politics of them versus us. And that's what they're trying to do desperately here. That's what AOC is all about right now. Keeping people inside that establishment Democratic bubble, that culture war bullshit bubble. You know what I'm saying? You're right. She did mention, DeSantis about, the way he is, when it comes to the culture wars, what he's doing with Disney, what he's doing with teachers. And she won't mention those foreign policy decisions because she'll probably be on the same page with him on the foreign policy. Yeah. At least it does when it comes to the whole Ukraine situation, the way he got off the bus, then got back on the bus. It was ridiculous. But that's the same thing she did in New York before, too, as well, when it came to Cuomo. She didn't want to talk about the whole situation when it came to the nursing homes where Cuomo forced people to go back into these nursing homes, essentially killing them, putting them in a situation where we had a lone city councilman. I forgot his name. I think it's City Councilman Kim. It was an Asian dude. And he was pretty much bringing attention to light. Where was AOC? Nowhere to be found on that. Silent. As soon as Cuomo got accused of playing grab ass, then she was out front. Oh, my God, with the rest of the progressives. And then he was fired. So he doesn't get fired for murder. He gets fired for bad sexual behavior. You know what I'm saying? It's like she'll always be on top of the culture wars. That's where she exists. That's where her base is. She's got nowhere else to go. She's not been able to move outside that. And unfortunately, more people in the United States, unfortunately for her, more people in the United States are like, okay, we get what you're doing with the culture war bullshit now. This is a divisive tactic, and you're using it so you don't have to answer questions about Ukraine. You don't have to answer questions about arming the Iron Dome. You don't have to answer any of those questions, whatsoever. You just have to move people over here, and that's what she's attempting to do. And that's all she can do, because that's all she's got. Yeah. Can we be done with that? I don't want to play any more of that video.
Yeah. No, we're done.
God. Who's this, fam?
So can you go back so I can read the tweet?
My bad.
This is a head of the U.S. State Department Press Service, Matthew Miller, and he accidentally said that this war has been a strategic failure for Ukraine, and he met Russia. So he Joe Biden this thing, okay? But yeah, we can just hear it just because it's fun, but also because, cluster bombs or not, Ukraine is not in a good position right now.
A few things. So I will say, with respect to your first question, we believe the war has been a strategic failure for Ukraine. The secretary spoke to this in a speech he gave in Helsinki last month, I believe it was. What's that? So, I'm sorry, a strategic failure for Ukraine. Thank you for the correction. Which is, I need more than one correction today. A strategic. This is the first time at the podium for a week. I'm apparently a little rusty. A few things. So I will say, with respect
a Freudian slip. He was being honest, I mean, It's a Freudian slip, fam. Whatever you want to call it, slip, but it was a slip. That was comedic relief.
Oh man.